Come on, easy learning with Chandanja. Today I am going to start a new chapter, The Homecoming, written by Rabindra Tagore. This part is only for audio purpose. If you want to get the explanation of this video, you can go to my other part of the video where you can satisfactorily enjoy the explanation. In this part of the video, I am going to only read the chapter. The Homecoming by Rabindra Tagore. About the author. Rabindra Tagore, the distinguished man of letters, was born in Calcutta, now in Kolkata, on 7th May 1861. He got his education at home. He was a great poet, dramatist, and novelist. He is a world famous figure. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913 for his collection of poems, Gitanjali. His famous works are Gitanjali, The Crescent Moon, Fruit Gathering, and Lover's Gift. In the novels Gora, The Wreck, and The Home, here we see his idealism and patriotism. The Homecoming and The Kabuli Bala are his fine short stories, which give us the understanding of human life. He was knighted in 1915, but he gave up the knighthood in protest against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. He was always addressed as Gurudev. He died in 1941. About the lesson. In The Homecoming by Rabindra Tagore, we have the theme of conflict, control, responsibility, love, and isolation. Taken from his collected stories collection, the story is narrated in the third person by an unnamed narrator, and from the beginning of the story, the reader realizes that Tagore may be exploring the theme of conflict. Makhan was listening to Fatiq, bringing conflict into the home. Fatiq's mother lacks the responsibility that is required to raise Fatiq. She likes he should go to Calcutta with his uncle Vishambar. Fatiq's school days in Calcutta were also miserable occasion for him. The unity that Fatiq had in the village, he does not have in Calcutta. A difficult role for any 14-year-old boy to play, particularly when they are not getting support that they need from adults around them. Fatiq missed the village is noticeable by the fact that he attempts to walk home to the village but instead manages to make himself sick. The end of the story is also interesting as it becomes clear to the reader that Fatiq, due to his illness, is delusional. It is there where the blame for Fatiq's premature death lays. Neither woman has shown Fatiq the love that deserved and needed. The author possibly suggesting that Fatiq should never have been taken out of the village environment he was used to. He was a lover to nature, but he ended his life surrounded by the walls of Calcutta. Fatiq Chakravarti was ringleader among the boys of the village. A new mischief got into his head. There was a heavy log lying on the mud flat of the river, waiting for be shaped into a mast for a boat. He decided that they should all work together to shift the log by a man force from its place and roll it away. The owner of the log would be angry and surprised, and they would all enjoy the fun. Everywhere seconded the proposal, and it was carried unanimously. But just as the fun was about to begin, Makhan, Fatiq's younger brother, sauntered up and sat down on the log in front of them, all without a word. The boy was puzzled for a moment. He was pushed rather timidly by one of the boys and told to get up, but he remained quite unconcerned. He appeared like a young philosopher meditating on the futility of games. Fatigue was furious. Makhan, he cried, if you don't get down this minute, I'll thrash you. Makhan only moved to a more comfortable position. Now, if Fatigue was to keep his regal dignity before the public, it was clear he ought to carry out his threat, but his courage failed him at the crisis. His fertile brain, however, rapidly seized upon a new maneuver which would discomfit his brother and afford his followers an added amusement. He gave the word of command to roll the log and Makhan over together. Makhan heard the order and made it a point of honor to stick on, but he overlooked the fact, like those who attempt earthly fame in others' matter, that there was peril in it. The boys began to heave at the log with all their might, calling out, 1, 2, 3, go. At the word go, the log went, and with it went Makhan's philosophy, glory, and all. All the other boys shouted themselves hoarse with delight, but Fatigue was a little frightened. He knew what was coming, and sure enough, Makhan rose from Mother Earth, blind as fate and screaming like the Furies. He rushed at Fatigue and scratched his face and beat him and kicked him, and then went crying home. The first act of the drama was over. Fatigue wiped his face and sat down on the edge of a sunken barge on the river bank and began to chew a piece of grass. A boat came up to the landing, and a middle-aged man with grey hair and dark moustache stepped on shore. He saw the boy sitting there doing nothing and asked him where the Chakravartis lived. Fatigue went on chewing the grass and said, over there, but it was quite impossible to tell where he pointed. The stranger asked him again. He swung his legs to and fro on the side of the barge and said, go and find out, and continued to chew the grass as before. But now a servant came down from the house and told Fatigue his mother wanted him. Fatigue refused to move, but the servant was the master on this occasion. He took Fatigue up roughly and carried him, kicking and struggling in impotent rage. When Fatigue came into the house, his mother saw him. She called out angrily, so you have been hitting Makhan again. Fatigue answered indignantly, no, I haven't. Who told you that? His mother shouted, don't tell lies, you have. Fatigue said suddenly, I tell you I haven't. You asked Makhan, but Makhan thought it best to stick to his previous statement. He said, yes, mother, Fatigue did hit me. Fatigue's patience was already exhausted. He could not hear this injustice. He rushed at Makhan and hammered him with blows. Take that, he cried, and that for telling lies. His mother took Makhan's side in a moment and pulled Fatigue away, beating him with her hands. When Fatigue pushed her aside, she shouted out, what, you little villain, would you hit your own mother? It was just at this critical juncture that the grey-haired stranger arrived. He asked what the matter was. Fatigue looked sheepish and ashamed. But when his mother stepped back and looked at the stranger, her anger was changed to surprise, for she recognized her brother and cried, "Why, Dada, where have you come from?" As she said these words, she bowed to the ground and touched his feet. Her brother had gone away soon after she had married, and he had started business in Bombay. His sister had lost her husband while he was in Bombay. Pishambar had now come back to Calcutta and had at once made inquiries about his sister. He had then hastened to see her as soon as he found out where she was. The next few days were full of rejoicing. The brother asked after the education of the two boys. He was told by his sister that fatigue was a perpetual nuisance. He was lazy, disobedient, and wild, but Makhan was as good as gold, as quiet as a lamb, and very fond of reading. Vishambar kindly offered to take fatigue off his sister's hands and educate him with his own children in Calcutta. The widowed mother readily agreed. When his uncle asked Fatigue if he would like to go to Calcutta with him, his joy knew no bounds, and he said, "Oh, yes, uncle," in a way that made it quite clear that he meant it. It was an immense relief to the mother to get rid of Fatigue. She had a prejudice against the boy, and no love was lost between the two brothers. She was in daily fear that he would either drown Makhan some day in the river, or break his head in a fright, or run him into some danger or other. At the same time, she was somewhat distressed to see Fatigue's extreme eagerness to get away. Fatigue, as soon as all was settled, kept asking his uncle every minute when they were to start. He was on pins and needles all day long with excitement, and lay awake most of the night. He bequeathed to Makhan in perpetuity his fishing rod, his big kite, and his marvels. Indeed, at this time of departure, his generosity towards Makhan was unbounded. When they reached Calcutta, Fatigue met the acquaintance of his aunt for the first time. She was by no means pleased with this unnecessary addition to her family. She found her own three boys quite enough to manage without taking any one else, and to bring a village lad of 14 into their midst was terribly upsetting. Vishambar should really have thought twice before committing such an indiscretion. In this world of human affairs, there is no worse nuisance than a boy at the age of 14. He is neither ornamental nor useful. It is impossible to show affection on him as on a little boy, and he is always getting in the way. If he talks with a childish lisp, he is called a baby, and if he answers in a grown-up way, he is called an impertinent. In fact, any talk at all from him is resented. Then he is at the unattractive growing age. He grows out of his clothes with indecent haste. His voice grows hoarse and breaks and quavers. His face grows suddenly angular and unsightly. It is easy to excuse the shortcomings of early childhood, but it is hard to tolerate even unavoidable lapses in a boy of 14. The lad himself becomes painfully self-conscious. When he talks with elderly people, he is either unduly forward or else so unduly shy that he appears ashamed of his very existence. Yet it is at this very age when in his heart of hearts a young lad most craves for recognition and love, but he becomes the devoted slave of anyone who shows him consideration. But none dare openly love him, for that would be regarded as undue indulgence and therefore bad for the boy. So what with scolding and chiding, he becomes very much like a stray dog that has lost his master. For a boy of 14, his own home is the only paradise. To live in a strange house with strange people is little short of torture, while the height of bliss is to receive the kind looks for women and never to be slighted by them. It was anguish to Fatigue to be the unwelcome guest in his aunt's house, despised by this elderly woman and slighted on every occasion. If she ever asked him to do anything for her, he would be so overjoyed that he would overdo it. And then she would tell him not to be so stupid but to get on with his lessons. The cramped atmosphere of neglect in his aunt's house oppressed Fatigue so much that he felt that he could hardly breathe. He wanted to go out into the open country and fill his lungs and breathe freely. But there was no open country to go to. Surrounded on all sides by Calcutta houses and balls, he would dream night after night of his village home and long to be back there. He remembered the glorious meadow where he used to fly his kite all day long, the broad river bank where he would wander about the livelong day singing and shouting for joy, the narrow brook where he could go and dive and swim at any time he liked. He thought of his band of boy companions over whom he was despot, and above all the memory of that tyrant mother of his who had such a prejudice against him, occupied him day and night, a kind of physical love like that of animals, longing to be in the presence of the one who is loved, an inexpressible wistfulness during absence, a silent cry of the inmost heart for the mother, like the lowing of call in the twilight. This love, which was almost an animal instinct, agitated the shy, nervous, lean, uncouth, and ugly boy. No one could understand it, but it preyed upon his mind continually. There was no more backward boy in the whole school than Fatigue. He gaped and remained silent when the teacher asked him a question, and like an overladen ass patiently suffered all the blows that came down on his back. When other boys were out at play, he stood wistfully by the window and gazed at the roofs of the distant houses. And if by chance he espied children playing on the open terrace of any roof, his heart would ache with longing. One day he summoned up all his courage and asked his uncle, "Uncle, when can I go home?" His uncle answered, "Wait till the holidays come." But the holidays would not come till November, and there was a long time still to wait. One day, Fatigue lost his lesson book. Even with the help of books, he had found it very difficult indeed to prepare his lesson. Now it was impossible. Day after day, the teacher would cane him unmercifully. His condition became so abjectly miserable that even his cousins were ashamed to on him. They began to jeer and insult him more than the other boys. He went to his aunt at last and told her that he had lost his book. His aunt pursued her lips in contempt and said, "You great clumsy county lout, how can I afford with all my family to buy you new books 5 times a month?" That night on his way back from school, Fatigue had a bad headache with a fit of shivering. He felt he was going to have an attack of malarial fever. His one great fear was that he would be a nuisance to his aunt. The next morning, Fatigue was nowhere to be seen. All searches in the neighborhood proved futile. The rain had been pouring in torrents all night, and those who went out in search of the boy got drenched through to the skin. At last, Vishambar asked help from the police. At the end of the day, a police van stopped at the door before the house. It was still raining and the streets were all flooded. Two constables brought out Fatigue in their arms and placed him before Vishambar. He was wet through from head to foot, muddy all over, his face and eyes flushed red with fever and his limbs all trembling. Vishambar carried him in his arms and took him into the inner apartments. When his wife saw him, she exclaimed, "What a heap of trouble this boy has given us. Hadn't you better send him home?" Fatigue heard her words and sobbed out loud, "Uncle, I was just going home, but they dragged me back again." The fever rose very high, and all that night the boy was delirious. Bishambar brought in a doctor. Fatigue opened his eyes, flushed with fever, and looked up to the ceiling and said vacantly, "Uncle, have the holidays come yet? May I go home?" Bishambar wiped the tears from his own eyes and took Fatigue's lean and burning hands in his own and sat by him through the night. The boy began again to mutter. At last his voice became excited. "Mother," he cried, "don't beat me like that. Mother, I am telling the truth." The next morning Fatigue became conscious for a short time. He turned his eyes about the room, as if expecting someone to come. At last, with an air of disappointment, his head sank back on the pillow. He turned his face to the wall with a deep sigh. Bishambar knew his thoughts and, bending down his head, whispered, "Fatigue, I have sent for your mother." The day went by. The doctor said in a troubled voice that the boy's condition was very critical. Fatigue began to cry out, "By the mark 3 fathoms, by the mark 4 fathoms, by the mark." He had heard the sailor on the river steamer calling out, "Mark on the plumb line." Now he was himself plumbing an unfathomable sea. Later in the day, Fatigue's mother burst into the room like a whirlwind and big and began to toss from side to side and moan and cry in a loud voice. Bishambar tried to calm her agitation, but she flung herself on the bed and cried, "Fatigue, my darling, my darling." Fatigue stopped his restless movements for a moment. His hand ceased beating up and down. He said, "Ah!" The mother cried again, "Fatigue, my darling, my darling." Fatigue very slowly turned his head and, without seeing anybody, said, "Mothers, the holidays have come." So with this, I have completed the reading of this chapter. Now I will explain this chapter in next parts of the video.